Hello, and welcome to another new series. Maybe this is just another fantasy chat. I'm not sure. On my channel here, definitely a different format than I've ever done before. I am sitting here with Craig from the Legendarium podcast. Say hello, Craig.
Hello.
We are going to be talking about whether fantasy series can legitimately be too big to adapt, and if so, what it is about them that causes them to be, quote-unquote, too big to adapt. How are you doing, Craig?
I'm not doing too bad.
I was afraid you were about to say not good. It's very glad you did not say that.
Well, I was a little excited because you said today we're going to be talking about weather, and that's a never-ending source of speech on on other channels. But I guess maybe that wouldn't quite fit here.
Yeah, well, since I moved to Ohio, everyone here talks about the weather nonstop. It's a bit obnoxious. But we will be talking about whether or not fantasy series can be too large to adapt. So I guess to start the conversation, I will simply pose the question to you here. Can a fantasy series be too large to ever adapt to a live-action, animated, or what have you adaptation from being just the book series itself?
No.
No. You think it is impossible
It was nice to talk
large.
to you, Daniel. It was a great video. No, it's okay. So I don't believe that it can. Certainly not anymore. The technology that we have available on the visual media is such now that we can't say that that world is too strange. This world is too big. There are too many characters. There's too much this or too much that. You can't say that anymore. That doesn't mean that there aren't other obstacles that you'd have to overcome. But somebody who says this is too big to adapt, I don't think that's a legitimate thing to say anymore. It's
funny. I agree with almost everything you said there, 90% of it. I think even like books like Malazan, Book of the Fallen, or series like Malazan, Book of the Fallen, we can. We have the technology. We have the budgets, especially now being thrown in. There's nothing you can put on a page we cannot show. But I disagree with the idea that there are series that are not too weird to be adapted, because after reading specifically The Dark Tower, I do not think it could translate to a visual medium.
And that's what I'm talking about, and that's why I kind of hedged a little bit and said that there are other things that may stop you. But as far as too big, yeah, that's not a thing. But when it comes to, too odd, too off the wall, this thing on the page, it doesn't work visually, I totally respect that idea. That being said, that was Tolkien's major complaint when people came to him and said, we want to adapt this. And he said, you can't.
Right.
Not just you can't, but it can't be done. And it turns out, I think he was wrong. Once the technology caught up, he was wrong. But he might have been right if his world was as weird as what Stephen King put on the page. Or even if his writing had been sufficiently odd, if that makes sense. And so, did you ever see The Road?
Oh, yeah.
It was it's kind of dystopian novel starring Aragorn.
Viggo Mortensen, yeah.
Viggo Mortensen. And anyway, did you ever read the book?
Yes, and disturbingly, it's my girlfriend's favorite book, and we're still talking about that.
Yeah, that's a topic for another day. But the one thing that you don't get from the movie that you do get from the book is the kind of iconic prose that you get on the page. You cannot adapt that onto screen, but you could. They were able to pull the imagery and whatnot, but it's a very different experience watching versus reading in that case, right?
Right, and that actually leads into something I wanted to touch on here that, to me, is where people get it entirely wrong. Like when I hear people say you can't adapt Malazan, you can't adapt Stormlight Archive, you can't adapt Wheel of Time, they always reference like the politics or the magic system or the scale of the world, which I just find to be silly. That's not even the things that would be the hardest to translate in my mind, not by a long shot. I find the things that would be the hardest to translate are things like that didn't quite get translated in The Road, like what the author was trying to communicate directly with their voice, what they were trying to make you feel, make you experience. That's where maybe some series would be incredibly difficult to adapt, because we can do a battle with 5 million people colliding in the battlefield. We can do these Doctor Strange visuals. That's never going to be an issue anymore. The issue is, can someone capture what Stephen King wanted to put in your brain when he wrote the ending of It, that infamous ending no one has even dared to try and adapt when they have adapted that book. That's where, and also the limitations of property rights that don't come in with books, the limitations of, what people are willing to display visually versus written word.
Right. So let me ask you a question, Daniel. As we pursue this topic and try to chase down, what we think about adaptations in general, would you think it's more fruitful for us to talk about what are the best adaptations that we can think of, especially in the fantasy genre, or is it more fruitful to talk about what we think the worst ones are and talk about why they are so bad?
Well, I think the answer to that comes with a simple answer of, I don't think an adaptation has ever been bad because the world was too big. With the topic at hand, it's never been the world was too big, that's why it failed. Like the Aragon movie was bad because they changed things they didn't need to change. It was just awkward and the acting was poor. Like that's why that failed. It was never it was the world was so huge. Even the Witcher TV show, it wasn't that the world was huge, it was that it was garbage. Like, and I'm not talking about the new one for people who aren't aware. There was an old actual Witcher TV show from a while back and it had a budget of $5 and it looks like it. That's what I'm referring to. And if an adaptation fails, it's not because the world's so big. It's because of other reasons. I feel like people saying the world's too big to adapt is just them throwing a cop-out out of saying like, well, I don't really know why this wouldn't work, so I'm just going to say the world's too big because I've heard other people say that. And I am guilty of saying that many times. So I'm not saying I'm not innocent there.
So are we going to bring up the elephant in the room here, and that's the upcoming Wheel of Time adaptation?
Maybe I'm so positive on the world's not the problem because I want that to work out so well. And if world is the problem, I'm going to be screwed here. But I don't think the size of the world is even the biggest issue with adapting Wheel of Time. I really don't.
I agree.
Yeah.
It's and this is a sweeping statement, and I'm happy to be proven wrong or right or whatever. But the big problem that we will see with the Wheel of Time is can they keep the stuff that people like about the characters, the character development, the relationships, and at the same time fix some of the shortcomings that no matter how big a fan you are, you have to admit are there. And so for me, it comes down to characters, and to a lesser extent events, but I'm not even so much worried about that. Like you say, if we're cleansing Sidene, the CGI artist can create all sorts of cool, sexual imagery in the sky, and that's going to be fine. It's going to work.
Yeah, who cares?
But can you bring Rand and Nynaeve to that point while maintaining who they are as characters and, and making you care about them the way that you do in the books?
Yeah.
By that point.
Maintaining, actually, yeah, you're absolutely right there. Actually earning the moments that the Wheel of Time maybe arguably does or does not earn in the written page in the visual medium where you are more constricted by time will be difficult. And a lot of people are going to hear me say that and go, well, you just admitted it's because the world's too big. That has nothing to do with the size of the world. It is about, actual acting ability, character beats, delivering of dialogue. That's not about the size of the world. But what I will say on top of that is I hope they take liberties with certain aspects of the Wheel of Time. Change the whole ending of The Eye of the World, in my opinion. Because Robert Jordan wrote that before he actually had all of his magic system, everything nailed down solidly. So that's why it feels so weird. Like, it feels weird and off compared to the rest of the series. And so I'm okay with liberties in certain areas. But I say that, and it feels like every time I mention adapting any fantasy adaptation, someone inevitably says, well, it won't work because of this. And what they're pointing to is something that I could whip up on a computer on some piece of software and make it look good. It's not about the visuals of the magic system. It's not about what the orc looks like. Of course, if they do it bad, but that's just them doing it bad, not that it's impossible to do.
Right. So what you're saying is, especially in the case here of the Wheel of Time, it can be done. It should be done well. It can be done well. It should be done well, but that doesn't mean there's not room for them to screw it up.
No, absolutely. Everything can be screwed up. You can screw up adapting The Cat in the Hat. We've seen that. That's easy to do. Screwing up is easy.
What is the worst fantasy adaptation of all time? I've got my answer, but I want to hear yours.
Have you seen the original Witcher TV show?
I have not. I haven't.
There's an episode that was on YouTube. I recommend you watch it because it's like watching one of Red Letter Media's breakdowns of like a bad B movie. It's that bad. It's just one of those things that leaves you going, why did you do that?
Nice.
Yeah, so I would say that. Or if we're talking about it's the worst because there was so much potential and they completely dropped the ball, I'd say The Hobbit. If we're going for potential versus execution rather than just overall execution, I'd say The Hobbit.
Yeah. I have a hard time putting The Hobbit quite on that level. I guess that's down here. The Hobbit, I did not like the Hobbit trilogy for the most part. There were things about it that I enjoyed, but yeah, that was a poor adaptation. But the worst fantasy adaptation, at least in recent memory, has to go to the Shannara Chronicles.
I have not had the pleasure of seeing those.
You know, what I might do is I'm going to send you a link. I actually recapped the first season. I did screen caps and commentary, running commentary on all 10 episodes of the first season. I'll send you that.
Okay.
We can throw it in the show notes if we want to, but it's absolutely piss poor, and the reason is kind of what you're saying. It's not about there's this visual or there's this event or something that they couldn't pull off. Yeah, there were budgetary concerns, and so they may have this battle may have been slightly different than what you see in the books. But what it came down to was the characters felt wrong compared to the source material. And then speaking of the source material, there was no respect for it. And so it was kind of jumbling all these characters and events so that somebody who is a longtime reader of Shannara was left scratching their head saying, why did you bring this person from book 3 into the book 2 story in a way that makes no sense? And if you're somebody who's not already a fan of the books, you're sitting there scratching your head being like, am I supposed to care about this person? It was like that line that you're supposed to straddle between being faithful to the story and adjusting to the new medium and a new audience. There's that line that you have to walk, but they found a different line and straddled it, and it was way off in the distance. It's completely bizarre. If you haven't ever watched it, I kind of recommend it, if only for the train wreck aspect of it. It's on Netflix. You can check it out. It's something.
I watch a lot of things for the train wreck. I read many things for the train wreck aspect of it, so that sounds up my alley. So this kind of leads me to a follow-up question I wanted to ask. Not because of size of world, but is there other reasons certain series cannot be adapted? For example, after reading the first book in the Broken Empire, I don't think Prince of Thorns can work live action because, yes, it can be fun to read and follow this character who's so awful, but I don't think that a large enough audience would be willing to sit through a season of a sociopath murdering, raping, etc., for it to work.
Yeah.
Do you agree? Is there other things that can say, no, this will not appeal to a large enough audience? Or no, any successful fantasy series can find its audience and succeed?
I am of the opinion that anything can find its audience in an adaptation. You can write something that's completely bizarre, but then adapt it really well. One awesome version of this would be Stardust. So if you've ever read the original Neil Gaiman Stardust, it's very Gaiman-y, and it's like 90s Gaiman-y, and it's a little bit odd maybe to the casual reader, somebody who's not used to his style particularly. And so the book isn't so approachable, but you can basically take the structure, the skeleton of his story, and then flesh it out again in a visual medium. And create something that I think was even better than his original. I think the movie is delightful and fantastic.
Wow.
Oh, yeah? You disagree?
No, I'm going, wow, isn't that high praise? I need to check it out if that's the high praise. That was an Owen Wilson, wow.
It's really nice. It's a great movie. But let me ask you this. Does size of the world... like you can't adapt this because the world's too big. Does that equate with the length of the series?
Yes and no.
Let me tell you why I ask you this. I ask you this because of the Stormlight Archive. I actually don't ask this because of the Wheel of Time. The Wheel of Time isn't as long it is as long as you think in page count, but it's not as long as far as events and whatnot. You could compress it really quite easily.
Very bluntly, it's that long. Sorry, very bluntly, it's that long because of Robert Jordan's writing style. It takes place over like 3 years.
But I think it's 2.5. Yeah, it's really short.
Right.
And so, like, I've kind of been arguing that you could take all 14 Wheel of Time books and compress them into maybe 5 seasons tops, and do it justice. For the most part, obviously you're going to leave some things out, but the reason I bring this up is because of the Stormlight Archive, which we've seen 3 out of 10 books of so far, and it's not that you couldn't make a very cool, artistically faithful adaptation that would work for, people who are diehards and would be really into it, but could you make something that will hold people's attention long enough while being faithful to enough of the story? And so is it because the world is too big or too crazy looking? I don't think so, but the length of the series, in that case at least, would come into play. And so does that make sense? Like with Game of Thrones, people kind of petered out.
The showrunners petered out.
There you go. I mean, that's kind of along the same lines as what I'm saying, but people peter out and they're like, it's not interesting, it's not new, it's not whatever anymore, and there's this other shiny object in the distance. And so if it makes sense, it's not about necessarily the artistic integrity of what's going on screen, but can you do something that's going to be cool long enough to keep people around so that you can make it to completion?
So my answer to that is going to pull from something completely... It's an interesting question, and I'm going to pull from something completely outside of fantasy. So have you read the Master and Commander series?
No.
Fantastic books. Incredible sea voyage, nuanced, detailed. You feel like you could run a ship after reading them. And a movie was made. And if the movie stayed to the first book, it would have had the Stormlight Archive problem, where it's so much in one book, and there's like 10 more books down the road. Could you keep an audience for that long? Can it be done? So what they did for the movie, which I thought was a good, interesting, artistic choice, was they basically took a storyline that spanned 5 books and focused on that storyline, condensed it to one movie, and added some of the storylines that went nicely with it, and did a great job of keeping the spirit of the story. No one will say it's a faithful adaptation, but it's still an adaptation done extraordinarily well because it captured that story brilliantly. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Ultimately, I mean, we're not going to solve the adaptation issue here, but it is interesting to talk about, what makes a good one and what makes a bad one. And do you feel like there is an answer to come to, or is it ultimately just the different strokes thing that we talk about with all art?
I think there is a bit of objectivity to this, and feel free to disagree. I love disagreement, where yes, there are certain things that just cannot be done loyally to the source material, whether it's because of what you're talking about where people will get exhausted. It's not the world size problem. It's just the audience or the showrunners themselves will get burnout. And there's things where it's too weird, like the Dark Tower is going to try to be adapted again. I'm concerned because there's Doctor Doom werewolf robots at one point that are literally Doctor Doom from the Fantastic Four werewolf robots. How is that going to come across and how are they going to get the rights to that? There are other bars that objectively make things very difficult and harder to adapt. But is anything because of size of world or because of weirdness impossible to adapt? I would say no.
No, I sorry, I know you like disagreement. I think I'm with you there. There are objective measures that we can use to say, whether something was a successful adaptation or not, however that's defined. But, ultimately, I bet that there are people who are watching this who, when I said the Shannara Chronicles was the worst adaptation ever, threw something at their computer monitor or their phone and said, this guy's insane.
You have 3 all caps comments already, right? If you look down there, they're all in caps.
What,
no
you think
punctuation.
I'm crazy enough to go read those comments? Anyway, I guess what it comes down to is, it's mostly subjective, but I think that there are... you can maximize your potential for success as an adaptor if you follow certain rules. And it might be interesting to tease out what those rules are, but I'm not sure I have them ready right now.
Well, there's a kind of natural follow-up to that I'd love to get your opinion on. Is there anything that is just poison to an adaptation? Is there anything you've seen consistently that if this is introduced, it fails? Like changing directors, or one of these things where they backed out in this one way. Is there anything you've seen that's consistently, this is why X, Y, and Z failed?
As far as a concrete event or moment like that, changing directors, I think you can survive changing directors. You can even survive changing cast members season to season to a certain extent. But if I can get a little philosophical for a moment here, it's always and forever death to any artistic project, but especially an adaptation. If you take something that treated its readers like intelligent human beings, and then you dumb it down to the point where you clearly think that your audience is a bunch of blithering morons. And so
Season 8 of Game of Thrones.
If you do that, you will kill your project. And so there are moments in The Hobbit where they do that. And those are the moments that make, Tolkien fans and general audiences in particular, in general, I should say, scratch their heads and say, what were you thinking? Why is he on a sled with rabbits? This isn't okay. This is not okay. Like, we're not morons, we're not tiny babies. Even Tolkien said when he wrote The Hobbit, he said there were moments in the first edition that I tweaked a little bit when the second edition came out because my kids hated it that I was talking down to them so much. Through the narrator in The Hobbit. And so he would tweak it just a little bit for that second edition so that it wouldn't come across so patronizing. This is one reason that the Shannara Chronicles was so poor, is that they didn't take their story seriously. It can be lighthearted, but if it ever gets silly, then, and it's not meant to be silly. This isn't, it's not a silly thing that you're putting on screen. That can be death to your project, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think a lot of people in the comments are going to do those comments where it's like, that's what I've always thought. That's what I...
Yeah.
But I would say that, and anytime we've seen them try to elongate or stretch out source material, and everyone knows how this ends, but they want to fill another season, so they just keep it going. Every time I've seen them do that, the prime example is Hobbit, obviously, but there are other storylines that have been adapted from, even I'd say the MCU's worst movies are the ones where they've take a comic storyline that was 5 issues, and they've just pulled it out and tried to make it this 2.5 hour long film,
right?
And it fails. I feel like if you, I don't know, there's something about trying to elongate source material where everything that's filler stands out so much that the original source material just dies. I've never seen filler really blend in with the original story well.
Right.
Unless you think of some counterexample.
Not off the top of my head. No, you got me there.
And I think that comes down to authorial, ownership. I mean, there's something, every author who's worth adapting carefully crafts their story to have beats, have things that play off each other, themes. And if someone, 5 years later during an adaptation just shoehorns in a scene where every character's in a barrel going down a river, jumping around, shooting orc, it's not gonna work well. Or if you elongate one page to be a whole movie, it's not gonna go. It's, I don't know. It's something about I just feel like every time you can feel like the author would not have made that choice.
Right.
Maybe I'm some high snob, but that's just what I feel about it.
Clearly, you're very snobbish. I think we can all come to peace with that. I will say this, in defense of The Hobbit, and this is one of the only defenses I have for The Hobbit, is that visually and audibly speaking, that is the definitive version of what a dragon should look like and sound like.
I agree. But my favorite dragon is still the one Tolkien drew that's really long and slender on the top of the pile of gold. The dragon in the Hobbit movie was not long and slender.
Right.
I want my dragons to look like they have an eating disorder. I don't know why. They're in a cave for hundreds of years not moving, and they still are beefy. It makes no sense.
Well, If it makes
I want
no sense,
logic
is
in
your
my
problem.
fantasy.
Maybe fantasy adaptations isn't quite the road that you should be, going down. If it makes no sense, is your thing.
I don't know. Any last questions you got here? Anything you want to bring up?
No, I think I'm good. I hope that. Okay, no, I do have one. I hope that with the
Okay.
Wheel of Time specifically, or The Witcher, or whatever other big adaptations we have coming up, we've talked a lot about the responsibility of the creators to create a good adaptation and stay faithful and all that stuff while bringing in a new audience and all of that. But I also want to point out that we as audience members have a responsibility as well to try to take these adaptations as we find them and not as we wanted them to be.
Absolutely.
And so if something comes out and it's not quite what you wanted it to be, back up a little bit and say, okay, but if I hadn't read The Wheel of Time eight times, front to back, and I didn't know every single thing about it, would this make sense? Would it be good for the story? Whatever. And so does that make sense? Like, as audience members, we need to remember our responsibility as well, so that we can welcome in some other new fans of a property.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I also ask that people double check before they accuse the adaptation of not being loyal, because so often people are like, well, this isn't accurate. And it's like, no, that's how it is. You're wrong.
You just read it wrong.
Yeah. Or the video game showed it that way, but it's not how it is in the books.
Right.
That happens all the time. And it just happened with Witcher, I think, again.
With the trailer?
And then, no, there was an image released of Geralt, and he had one sword in his back, and everyone who played the games was like, he should have two, unsubscribe, dislike, it's it's horrible. And it's like, no, in the books, he keeps his other sword on Roach, his horse, which is the best name for a horse ever, and he just has the one on his back, and they're being loyal to the books. Although after the trailer came out, there's not much that I'm able to spot as in that was in the book, but hey, they can have fun with it. I don't care.
Nice.
Yeah. No, I'm not one of these people who wants everything to be super loyal to books. I think that can be a huge detriment when they do try to stick page to page. That can be very bad as well, especially in today's day and age where people want, action intense now. And if you want to be successful with an audience, sometimes, a certain fantasy series, there's not action for a third of the book. And so for making the visual medium flow, for making a movie actually resonate with people, you need to have those 5 minutes of something happening where it's intense and it's explosions, pew pew, because that's how that needs to happen.
Right.
Yeah. Any fantasy series you really want to see adapted that you haven't heard an announcement for yet?
This kind of comes with or it goes along with my take it as you find it. I don't tend to wish for adaptations.
Okay.
Just because there's such a poor track record out there, especially of fantasy. And so I don't wish for anything, but if I were to, gosh, now I have to look at my shelf behind me. No, everything I see here, it's already either been announced or been done, and maybe been done poorly.
Okay.
And so I'm sure that people will say oh, I want to see this thing, and I have my favorites that haven't been adapted, but do I wish that they've been adapted? No, I'm good with loving them as they are, and then if they do get adapted later, fingers crossed, hope it's done well, but again, take it as I find it.
Okay, good answer. I like it. I'm totally in the other end of the spectrum, and I'm looking forward to Mistborn being adapted. I want that so bad. I'm looking forward to, I want Gentleman Bastards so bad. I love good live action adaptations.
I would take Gentleman Bastards before Mistborn, even though I love Mistborn more. That seems a little more adaptable to me, although I would like to see Mistborn adapted as a game before I'd like to see it adapted as a movie or a show.
I've been on record saying Mistborn is the most turn it into a video game fantasy story I've ever read.
For sure.
That needs to be a game made by CD Projekt Red, or however you say that, so fast. It needs to happen.
Right. Agreed.
And you see Brandon offered them the rights to like his stories on Twitter. He was like, "Hey, you guys did an amazing job with Witcher. Do you want Cosmere?" And then everyone was like, "Kid, what?" And then we didn't get to. I'm sure talks happened, but we didn't hear anything after that.
That would be pretty cool.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Greg. Everyone, if you have not checked out my recording stopped, so we're all audio now. For some reason, my camera just stopped recording me.
Okay.
But I didn't notice that. But you haven't been seeing my face for a minute. Sorry about that, audience. If you have not checked out the Legendarium podcast, please do so. They are honestly, probably like in terms of general fantasy talk, my favorite podcast out there to sit down and listen to. You guys are opinionated. You stand by your arguments. You have good banter. I enjoy it.
Well, that's high praise. I appreciate that.
Yeah. So go check them out if you have not already. Do you say like and subscribe for a podcast? What do you do for a podcast?
Please listen and tell your friends and review us on iTunes unless you hate us.
Okay, yeah, don't leave 1-star reviews. Don't be those people. I saw a 1-star review because they were saying the person had an accent, and the person had an Irish accent. How dare someone not like an Irish accent?
And
That's
also,
not allowed.
How dare you leave a review based on that? That's weird.
It is. I agree.
It's
anyway,
offensive and just weird.
It is. Like and subscribe if you have not already. Hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here and get looks into the stories I am writing. And have a good one, y'all. Peace.